Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bev Lang, and I'm the Executive Officer with Elder Abuse Action Australia. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia that we're meeting on today and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm on Darkinjung land on the central coast of New South Wales, about an hour and a half north of Sydney, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. Welcome to EAAA's Lunch and Learn program. We relaunched these webinars late last year and have been delightfully surprised at the interest in our programs to date. And the intention of these sessions is to give our members the opportunity to showcase their work or a particular topic of interest, or in Anna's case, her absolute passion around numbers and data. Before I introduced Anna, just a little bit of housekeeping for us to be reminded of through this session. We've got two one-question polls that'll pop up later in Anna's presentation. Each question has a couple of multiple choice answers. It won't take you long to respond, and we'll leave those polls open for 30 seconds to a minute for you to respond, and we'll share those results live. Please use the chat, which is in the bottom of your screen, to ask any questions or to make any comments. And of course, we ask you to be respectful of each other in your interactions in this environment, and of course to Anna. Anna's going to respond to any questions at the end of her presentation, so we'll gather those up. I'll come back on screen and collect anything that perhaps more than one of you have asked or made comments on for her to answer. If you require CC captions, please turn that on. That's again on the bottom of your screen. Just turn captions on so you'll be able to hear and see what Anna is talking to. This session is being recorded for the purposes of reproducing a video of the webinar. It'll be loaded up onto the EAAA site early next week, and of course it will also be circulated to anyone who's registered for this webinar. So if your colleagues have happened to have missed out or haven't registered, it will be available for anyone to see. There'll be a survey that'll pop up just at the end of the webinar, and we appreciate your feedback on anything that you wish to share with us. This is a program that's evolving, and your insights are very welcome and important to developing content and speakers and topics that are of interest to you, our audience. And now to Anna. Anna Gilbard is from UnitingCare. She is a person I've been working with, I think, since I've been involved with EAAA. So welcome, Anna. She's the research officer with UnitingCare. As I've mentioned, Anna is very passionate about data, and she's using that to improve the lives of older people and has been heavily influenced by her practice experience. She's conducted numerous research projects, always focusing on research that has realistic implications for policy and practice. Anna has expertise, and his expertise has been recognised with invitations to provide input to research projects around the country. She's also undertaking a PhD at the University of Queensland, investigating the dynamics and drivers that underlie the abuse of older people with cognitive impairment. Please join me in welcoming Anna Gilbard.
Thank you, Bev, and thank you everybody who's taken the time out of their day to attend. I really appreciate it. Our next slide, please, James. I'd just like to acknowledge that I come to you today from the lands of the Gubbi Gubbi people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Next slide, please. Before I start, I'd like to talk about the language that I'm going to use. I tend to use the word victim rather than victim survivor, because not all victims in our sample actually have survived the abuse, and I mean no disrespect with this. I'd also like to acknowledge the staff from UnitingCare Queensland's Elder Abuse Helpline. Without their dedication to taking the calls and entering the data into our database, this presentation would not be possible. I'd also like to let you know, don't worry about trying to write any of this down. The slides will be sent out with the link to the recording. And finally, I would like to warn you that I'm going to bombard you with data, but then I'm at least going to try to explain what the data means. So hopefully it won't be too onerous, because I know not everybody is a fan of data. The sample for the study was 12,324 cases of elder abuse that were entered into the database over a 6-year period. The cases consisted of abuse relationships where the perpetrators were either family members or informal carers. There were 8,423 female victims, 3,884 male victims. And I'd also like to note that we collect the data on gender rather than biological sex. So if a victim identifies as female, female would be selected. I did have to exclude one case from analysis where the gender of the victim was identified as non-binary. The sample was simply too small for analysis. And there were further 16 cases that were excluded because the victim's gender was unknown. So the final sample size was 12,307. And the analyses consisted of simple descriptive statistics and cross-tabulation. I do want to advise you that there are limitations to our data. So the first thing is accuracy. The data is collected through voluntary disclosures by notifiers. So the information provided could be subjective and may not be a complete account of a situation. The second is sampling. The abuse cases reported to the helpline may not reflect prevalence, patterns and characteristics of elder abuse in the community. The data only contains information about cases that are reported to the helpline. Some cases may never be reported and others may be reported directly to other services such as the police. And this impacts on the data that we actually have for analysis. Next slide, please. Females were overrepresented as victims, with more than 2/3 of victims reported to be female. Some people believe that this overrepresentation is due to female longevity, but our data does not support this hypothesis. Next slide, please. A comparison between our data and population data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics showed that females were overrepresented as victims across all age groups. If the overrepresentation was simply due to females living longer, the proportions of male and female victims would be similar to their population proportions. Or in English, the bars for male and female victims in each age group would match up with the lines that represent the populations of males and females for the age groups. What we actually see is females overrepresented across all age groups, and the greatest disparity is in the younger age groups. This tells us that the reason for the overrepresentation isn't as simple as female longevity, and we need to look deeper to try to understand what's going on. Next slide, please. So the victim demographics. Females experienced greater financial disadvantage than male victims. They were more likely to be receiving Centrelink payments, less likely to be receiving income from investments and superannuation, and less likely to own a home. 1/3 of victims were widowed and 1/3 were in a couple relationship. This was very different to male victims. So male victims were more likely than female victims to be receiving an income from investments and superannuation and more likely to own a home. Significantly more male victims had impaired capacity and more than half were in couple relationships. The most common age group for both male and female victims was 80 to 84 years. Next slide, please. Where victims were, next is the perpetrator demographics. So where victims were female, the average perpetrator was aged 50 to 54 years. The perpetrators were significantly more likely to be male, experiencing mental illness or misusing substances. Where victims were male, the average perpetrator was aged 50 to 54 years and significantly more likely to be female. However, if you took out intimate partners, the gender of perpetrators is much more balanced and is close to half and half, irrespective of victim gender. Next slide, please. The relationships. 76.7% of the perpetrators where the victims were female were adult children. There was 39.2% daughters and 37.5% were sons. For male perpetrators, only 64% were adult children. And this was 33.7% were sons and 30.3% were daughters. When it came to adult children, female victims were significantly more likely to be living with the perpetrators than male victims. Another notable difference related to the proportion of victims who were experiencing abuse from spouses or partners. As you can see in the chart, there were significantly more male perpetrators, or the proportion of male victims who were experiencing abuse from their spouses or partners was significantly higher. It was more than double that of female victims. I was really interested in this because it wasn't at all what I expected, so I'm going to delve into this a bit deeper later on in the presentation. Next slide, please. So what were the precipitating factors? Precipitating factors are factors which precede the abuse but seem to have contributed to the development of the abuse. An example is victim ill health. An older person may become unwell and end up in hospital. They give their ATM card to one of their children so that they can pay their bills while they are in hospital. The child then uses the ATM card to withdraw cash for their own use. In this scenario, the victim's ill health didn't cause the abuse, but it led to a series of events that gave the adult child the opportunity to financially abuse the older person. Not every case has precipitating factors. In some cases, the abuse may have been occurring for a very long time and may not have a clear event that preceded it. Where we did have information about precipitating factors, for female victims, victim ill health was only slightly more frequently identified than commencing cohabitation with perpetrators. For male victims, victim ill health was significantly more often reported, followed by cohabitation. Next slide, please. Abuse involving female victims was most often reported by the victims themselves, followed by daughters and workers. Abuse involving male victims was most often reported by daughters, followed by victims and workers. And male victims were significantly less likely to self-report the abuse. And we can see that for female victims, a quarter of the notifiers were the victims themselves, whereas it was only a fifth for cases where the victim was male. Next slide, please. So what were the abuse types? Overall, psychological, financial, and social abuse were the most frequently reported abuse types for both male and female victims. Victims were significantly more likely to be fearful about losing the relationship with the perpetrator. For female victims, fear of further harm was also significantly more likely to be identified as a barrier to change. Whereas for male victims, their individual vulnerabilities were more likely to present as barriers to change. And once again, the male victims were significantly more likely to have capacity impairment. I know that I've covered a lot of data, and I'm sure your head is spinning and you're probably wondering what it means and how it fits together. And while I don't have all the answers, I thought I could talk about some of the themes that were present in the data. So the key theme with regards to female victims related to their role as a mother and the influence that this has had on their situation. In 3/4 of cases where the victims were female, the perpetrators were the adult children. And more than half of the children who were perpetrators were living with the female victims. Many of the perpetrators who did live with victims had issues such as mental illness or issues with substance misuse. These findings make a lot of sense when you consider the historical context. Older women were consistently told that their role was to stay at home and look after the children, and in many cases they were even banned from working after they were married. When faced with the abusive behaviour from an adult child, female victims were more likely to blame themselves for their child's behaviour, and more fearful of losing the relationship with the perpetrator if they report or take action to stop the abuse. Female victims who are experiencing abuse from adult children often call the helpline because they're at breaking point. And what they really want is their adult children to receive support, particularly if there are concerns around mental illness or substance misuse. Their role as a mother, carer, and protector continued long after their children became adults, and they don't want negative consequences for their children. Another key theme for female victims was financial inequality. Female victims were more likely to be receiving payments from Centrelink, less likely to have income from investments, and less likely to own a home. This is not surprising given that older women were expected to stop work once they were married, and the women who did work often had breaks from work to have children. As a consequence, most older women have little to no superannuation. Females were also more likely to be widowed. This can increase financial disadvantage as there may only be one income to cover the cost of rent or their mortgage, along with utilities and other expenses. When split across 2 incomes, this is much more manageable. This financial inequality can leave older women more dependent on perpetrators and less able to take action to stop the abuse. And consistent with this, female victims were more fearful of becoming homeless if they took action. For male victims, the key issues were different. They seem to relate to ageing and health issues. Male victims were more likely to have impaired capacity reported, and victim ill health was more likely to be identified as a precipitating factor. Although the average age group for both male and female victims was the same, males often experience more chronic health conditions and die at an earlier age than females. A male born 80 years ago had a life expectancy of 72 years. So males who are in that 80 to 84 year age group have already well and truly exceeded that. Male victims were also more likely to be reported to be experiencing abuse at the hands of spouses or partners than female victims. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a deeper look at that. Next slide, please. And we just have a little poll for you. Can we put the poll up? So what percentage of reported victims of intimate partner violence do you think were female? And you've got 30 seconds to answer the question, and then we'll talk about it. Hopefully nobody's already feeling data overload and wanting to stab me in the eye. I know it's not everybody's favourite thing. Is it possible to get the results posted up? Thank you. So it looks like most people thought that 70% of the victims were female, and the second was 90%. Is the poll still up there? Can we take, if the results are up there, can we make them disappear and go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So there were 758 female victims, which was 9% of all female victims, reported to be experiencing abuse at the hands of spouses or partners, and that included ex-spouses and ex-partners. 90.9% were current partners and 9.1% were ex-partners. There were 754 male victims, which was 19.4% of all male victims, reported to be experiencing abuse at the hands of spouses, partners, or ex-spouses, partners. 82.9% were current partners and 17.1% were ex-partners. So there was a much higher rate of ex-partners in where the victims were male. So the actual answer to what proportion, it was almost spot on 50%. So 50.1% of the female victims were female victims in this where the perpetrators were spouses, partners, and 49.9% of the victims were male. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why do you think that this is? I am not 100% sure, so I'd like to hear what you think. There's a little poll coming up and you've got 30 seconds to answer it before we talk about it. I went down an absolute rabbit hole with this because I didn't like that I couldn't understand why this could be the case. Hopefully it's as interesting for other people as it is to me. Can we close the poll and display the results, please? Okay, so the most common answer with a resounding 62% was all of the above. Next, it was female perpetrators are more likely to be caring for male spouses or partners. And that was one of the things that I thought might be the case. So let's see what the data says. Oh, good work, you're ahead of me. So the demographics of the victims. The average age group for victims was 75 to 79 years, and this was for both male and female victims. And this is younger than the overall age of 80 to 84 that was the average when you looked at the whole lot of the data. For female victims, 5% of victims lived in residential aged care facilities, and 47.2% of victims had cognitive impairment. And these were not significantly different to male victims. So for male victims, 10.2% of victims lived in residential aged care facilities, which was double that of females. And I was surprised that that didn't show up as significant, but it didn't. And 47.5% of victims had cognitive impairment. So that's not much different to female victims. Next slide, please. Age by gender is really interesting in the context of intimate partner violence. So what we saw earlier when we looked at the whole sample was that females were overrepresented across all ages. But in this sample, females are overrepresented as victims until 65 to 69 years of age. Then male and female victims are fairly similar to what's expected based on population data until we get to 80 to 84 years. From 85 years onwards, males were overrepresented as victims. So this is the opposite of what we saw earlier and is absolutely not what I expected. Next slide, please. So who were the perpetrators? For female victims, 98.3% of perpetrators were male. The average age group for perpetrators was 75 to 79 years. And this is significantly different to male victims. 53.6% of perpetrators owned a home and 20.4% of victims self-reported the abuse. For male victims, 97.1% of the perpetrators were female, which is to be expected. It just shows that there were 2.9% of cases where the couples were both male. The average age group for perpetrators was 65 to 69 years. So this is 10 years younger than that of female victims. And that's particularly interesting to me because the age of the victims were the same for both groups, but the perpetrators are 10 years younger where the victims were male. 46.5% of perpetrators owned a home, so that's much lower, but it makes sense given that most of the perpetrators are female and females typically have lower home ownership rates, or in the older age groups anyway. 14.5% of victims self-reported the abuse. So male victims, again, were significantly less likely to report the abuse. What's also of interest is that both of the reporting rates for both male and female victims were lower than the overall sample. So that suggests that they are less likely to report abuse when it's their spouse or partners, which, once again, I wouldn't have predicted. And where the victims were male, the perpetrators were significantly more likely to be dependent on the male victims for accommodation and financial support. And once again, that comes back to female perpetrators who may face greater financial inequality and also the lower home ownership rates. Next slide, please. Overall, psychological abuse, financial abuse, and neglect were most frequently reported for both genders. However, there were some differences in the proportion of victims of each gender who experienced the different types of abuse at the hands of their spouses or partners. Female victims were significantly more likely to experience physical abuse and sexual abuse than male victims. And male victims were significantly more likely to experience financial abuse. There's a part of me that does wonder if part of the reason why males more financial abuse is that they possibly have more assets and greater financial wealth, but there's no way to test that. Or not in our data anyway. Next slide, please. The next thing I looked at was the duration of the abuse. So how long had the abuse been going on? Most females had been experiencing the abuse for 10 years or more, whereas most males had been experiencing the abuse for 0 to 2 years. And interestingly, a greater proportion of cases in the 0 to 2 years for male victims were ex-spouses or partners. So what does this all tell us? The abuse reported for female victims of spouses, partners appears to be different than that reported for male victims. For female victims, in most cases, the abuse had been going on for more than 10 years. This suggests that it has been a long-term abusive relationship and may not necessarily be related to age. They often call this domestic violence grown old. So the risk factors and particularly societal factors will be different for this. If you think about some of the historical factors, like women were able to be chastised physically by their husbands, and it even kind of went further than that. Males were expected to keep their women in line. Women couldn't get a divorce, whereas now you can get a no-fault divorce. If they wanted a divorce, they had to prove that the spousal partner had done something wrong. You've also got marital rape wasn't considered rape. So women were less likely to firstly recognise some of this behaviour as abusive, and also if they did, there was nothing they could do about it. And so often women stayed in these relationships for longer. Even within the different abuse types, the abuse behaviours directed towards female victims were also different. So for female victims, there was a lot of coercive control behaviours, such as withholding access to money, and that was reported significantly more often if the victim was female. For male victims, it appears to be a different situation. It's hard to really know why the abuse duration is so much shorter. Is it that they are now getting into new relationships and that's what's going on? Or I'm not sure, to be honest, but it definitely seems to be a different pattern and seems to be more related to aging. And that's why when you looked at the gender by age, they were represented as greater proportions in some of the older age groups, which goes against what we know about how long males live. So overall, they were overrepresented in the older age groups. There was a greater proportion of ex-spouses as perpetrators, and that could be a factor in it too. It could be that the ex-spouses are concerned about not getting what they see as an equitable divorce settlement, and so financial abuse could come into that. They were more likely to, experience financial abuse. So, as I said, I'm not really sure why. I did look at differences, whether perpetrators were caring for victims more in male, whether victims were male, and there was no difference. I looked at capacity impairment and cognitive impairment, and there were no significant differences. I looked at whether the perpetrator might be the decision maker more often in cases where victims were male, because particularly with financial abuse, if you're the attorney under an EPOA, that gives greater options for, or not greater options, but it can make it easier to commit financial abuse. And I also looked at whether male or female victims were experiencing more types of abuse simultaneously, and that there was no difference there, and the frequency of abuse. There was no difference. So I thought we could go back to the poll questions and look at the answers. So the first option was normalisation of violence against women. I can't say that that's not the case. It might be more of a shock when abuse is perpetrated against male victims, and so that could lead to more daughters ringing in, whereas abuse against female victims, A, it's been going on longer, and B, it's probably more normalised within society. So that could be a factor, and it could just mean that the cases of violence against male victims is getting reported more often. Female victims also could be reporting to services like DV Connect to, and that could influence the numbers and the gender breakdown. The second the second option in the poll was female victims were less likely to report the abuse, and that wasn't true in our sample. We found that female victims were more likely to self-report the abuse. The next option in the poll was female perpetrators were more likely to be caring for male spouses or partners. And I really thought this was going to be where we would find significant differences, but that wasn't true in our data. And D was male victims likely to be perpetrating violence against victims, so the mutual aggression. And even though I haven't displayed the results for that, there was no significant difference there either. And finally, all of the above, which we've already discussed that our data didn't show some of those. The next thing I'm going to talk to you about is the gender lens for elder abuse. Next slide, please. So Celebrate Aging has developed a resource as part of their Embolden Festival in 2024. The resource is a report that discusses the gender lens for elder abuse, and it also contains an assessment tool. It highlights the gendered nature of elder abuse and provides guidance about applying a gender-specific approach for elder abuse prevention and intervention. Next slide, please. So as I said, they've got a gender lens assessment tool included in the resource. It has 7 steps, and each of the steps has a series of questions that sit under it to help guide the thinking. Step 1 and 2 relate to historical and contemporary factors, inequalities. And this is something that came up a lot in the data. We saw the differences between males and females with regards to financial inequality. And we also saw that the abuse of where the victims were female, the abuse was different and the barriers to change were different. Particularly when it came to adult children and the whole mothering and the role of a mother and around protecting children. So I think it's important to consider historical and contemporary inequalities when you're looking at elder abuse. And with contemporary inequalities, the cost of living and lower is influenced by older women not owning homes as often. So they're more likely to be paying rent, more likely to be facing financial disadvantage and more at risk of homelessness. We know the largest increasing homelessness groups has been older women. Then we've got step 3 is including marginalised groups. Step 4 is gathering data on gender and elder abuse. Step 5 is identifying data patterns and service gaps, and we've done a little bit of that today. Step 6 is developing and implementing a gender equality plan. And step 7 is evaluating outcomes and consolidating achievements. I think when you're looking at trying to prevent elder abuse, given the differences we've seen, you need to consider gender when you're looking at prevention methods. Dr. Catherine Barrett from Celebrate Aging is hosting the launch of a gender lens for elder abuse on the 9th of April. So I'm not going to steal her thunder. If you want to know more about it, you're going to have to attend the webinar. And the link for the registration form is on the slides. But you can also find it on Humanitics. Next slide, please. So what are the key take-home messages? Females are overrepresented as victims in reports of elder abuse. In cases of intimate partner violence, male and female victims were equally represented, but there were differences. Historical and contemporary inequality can influence risk of elder abuse experiences of elder abuse, barriers to change, and support needs. And you should always consider gender differences and inequality when formulating responses to elder abuse. Another thing is that I think it would be great to see further research to understand whether males do experience higher rates of intimate partner violence in later age, and why this might be, particularly if you could talk to older people themselves. Okay, I'm open for questions now.
Thanks so much, Anna. I'm going to Bryony Kennedy has a couple of questions for you, some of which you might have touched on, but I suspect there's more detail that you have up your sleeve. Regarding the 50-50 split of female to male victims, she's really interested to know the types of abuse experienced and the role of cognitive impairment and carer status. And also the types of abuse is the second part of her question.
Okay, so I did look at carer status for, I'm assuming she's talking about perpetrators, but she could be talking about victims. And if it's about victims, I don't have information about that, whether the victims are caring for the perpetrators. But if it's about perpetrators caring for victims, there was no significant difference as a in regards to whether the victim was female or male. And the abuse types, we did touch on that. So males were significantly more likely to experience financial abuse than females in intimate partner violence cases. And females were more likely to experience, and males were also more likely to experience neglect. Whereas females were significantly more likely to experience physical abuse and sexual abuse.
I mean, and that's interesting because sexual abuse in terms of the prevalent study is one of the lower or the less prevalent types of abuse. Interesting.
We get low numbers too, but I think it's vastly underrepresented. When I've spoken to older women on the phone, sometimes I've had one quite long conversation and the lady rang about something completely different, and that's often what happens. They don't outright call about sexual abuse and don't disclose it until you've built rapport. Sometimes it's towards the end of the call that they'll suddenly say, you know, that they want to talk about this. So it's something that women don't talk about. And I think that's why the numbers are so low. I don't think it's that older women aren't experiencing sexual abuse. I just think it's underreported. Yeah,
and certainly the work of Catherine Barrett would suggest that to be the case. And we probably know that from earlier ages of women reporting. And Heather Trimble asks, do you take any stats regarding cultural influences in relation to victims and perpetrators?
We actually do, but I haven't got those in front of me. If you'd like to share my email address when you send out the slides, I'm happy for anybody to send me through questions and I can answer it once I had a look at the data.
Well, that's a nice segue actually, Anna, because we will in the last webinar, I don't think we recorded adequately. We hadn't turned something on to collect the Q&A and chat. But we will do that. So we'll pass these questions back to you and you can provide any further detail. That'd be fantastic. We'll try and not bombard your inbox if we can avoid it.
What's the official term? I will take that question on notice. Isn't that how it goes?
Correct. Yeah, something like that. And Gary Ferguson asks, can you say whether in IPV, the respondent's sexuality information was collected?
We do. We just have a tick box for LGBTIQA+. So I could tell how many were ticked in both female and male victims of intimate partner violence. So,
and is it a significant proportion of the data?
It was only a small amount. I can't tell if that's like, if this isn't prevalence data. So I can't tell if it's because it's just not recorded or not reported, but let me find it. So for female victims, there was, you're making me math on the run, 1.7% of cases were recorded as LGBTIQA relationships. Oh, yeah, same-sex relationships.
Yes, I think same-sex is illegal.
Sorry. And for male victims, it was 2.9% of the cases were same-sex relationships.
Interesting. Okay.
I'd like to look at that. I started looking at that a while ago, but you need to have enough data for it to be meaningful to be able to do statistical analysis. So I'm still waiting to have enough cases. I looked at whether I'm getting close. Another year, I reckon, of data and I'll be fine.
So Kathy Mansfield asks, are there any comparative studies from other countries across the world that can be used to moderate or risk manage in Australia?
Oh, there is heaps. And so many different countries are doing so many different things.
Yeah.
One of the things that's been of interest to me lately has been around mandatory reporting by banks. I know they do that in some areas in America, and I've read a couple of papers on it, and I'd be interested to see how that would play out. Sometimes mandatory reporting can be more detrimental. If you force all home care services to be mandatory reporters, they just stop, the perpetrators are likely to stop the home care workers come in, and that actually increases the risk. But it's hard to, if all banks are doing the same thing, it's hard to get out of being a bank, using a bank. If you'd have to withdraw a huge sum of money, which if they're mandatory reporters would automatically trigger mandatory reporting. So I don't know. It's something I've been thinking about.
It's a long question, and I will say, Kathy, that we're doing a little bit of work at the moment. We've been given a little bit of extra funding. We're not doing the research ourselves. Well, we're hunting around for what exists around the country, around the world, with a couple of views in mind. One is to, see if we can find some interesting speakers from overseas for the conference, but also what that data might be telling us, how it might change the language we use, for example, any programs and activities that are more, having great outcomes. So we'll be sharing that in due course. But yeah, great question. Thank you. We might put that one on notice. And Yumi Lee asks, Anna, can you please speak to why sexual assault data is hard to collect and what you've done to address this?
So, as I said, it's often underreported. One thing we have, or something that we have done, is we had staff attend specialised sexual abuse training for that related to older women, and that was run by the Gold Coast Centre for Sexual Violence. I hope that's right. It's close, if not. And that was really useful. And I actually changed our definitions and what we collected data on in our database, because they had a lot that I hadn't thought about, such as forced nudity, or even, this was, I guess, ageism on my part. I hadn't considered that the whole virtual, showing photographs or threatening to show photographs might be a factor, a form of sexual abuse, whereas, that's very common, that revenge porn and things for younger age groups, that I hadn't even considered that with older people. I'd mostly concentrated initially on offences such as rape and attempted rape, but since we all did that training, I've broadened it a lot to collect more data, and it helps staff to also recognise more what sexual abuse behaviours are. It changes the way we think about things. I think that's really valuable for all staff.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point, Anna, and one that we can all take on. I think not just in terms of that particular topic, but how knowledgeable we are about different cultures, different language, behaviours, etc. Jane Marshall asks, do you collect coercive control, I'm assuming let's call it data or fields in the elder abuse data?
So we don't have anything called coercive control. And when I tried looking at data to analyse around this once before, and we have a lot of fields that could be could fit under coercive control, but it's really challenging because everybody has different definitions of coercive, what is coercive control. And also some of the ones that for younger people may not be the same for older people. So could misusing an EPOA and using it to withhold access, like not paying the aged care fees, could that be considered to be a form of coercive control? I'd like to see somebody put out a paper that clearly defines what coercive control looks like in older people as far as behaviours. And I'd be really interested to see what our data shows, but we have got a lot. So even social abuse, that's a common coercive control measure. We've got, in some of the financial abuse behaviours, some of the psychological abuse behaviours, particularly around threats and intimidation. But until somebody can clearly give me a list of behaviours to look at, it's hard to, we do collect data, it's just, it's not easy to define.
And I think it'd be interesting for us to circulate post this session where people might be able to see, because you put out annual reports, do you not, on the elder abuse data? So we'll a note to us would be to share the links to that in when we share your slides.
Most the more recent reports don't have the full list of the abuse behaviours we capture. Because we've cut it back a lot, and so we only report the most common, but the older ones do.
Okay.
About 2021.
We'll let people investigate that one. Barbara Struthers, it would be interesting to know the relationship history in these IPV elder abuse instances. Is that something that staff at EA Helpline could ask about, or do they already?
They might ask about it, and but we don't have, most of the data is categorical data. There is an other field, but I agree. When I started looking at this, I wanted to know how many of these are new relationships for male victims, and how many, because there were some of the age gaps between male victims and perpetrators were really quite large. So I was really interested to see whether this is males possibly become more vulnerable and susceptible to those sort of, not exactly romance scams, but new friends who become partners and may have ulterior motives. But I wish we had a bit more information, but we're limited in what we capture.
I'm going to come back to yours, Brian, if we have time, but because you've had a couple of questions, but we will answer it outside of the session. So Christina Matthews asks, looking towards ending abuse, is your data collection utilised more in lobbying government or in planning for education of community? Great question, Christina.
To be honest, I don't fully know. I do know, I have been told of instances where it has been used to show the need for services in certain areas of Queensland that the government has advised me, but I don't really know because it depends who reads it, and I can't tell, sorry.
And I look at, there's a whole bigger question about standardising data in each of the state and territory helplines, because they all collect slightly different things, different definitions and so forth. And for me, that's a bigger question. We've been looking at helplines for a little while, Christina, and it certainly came up as a hot topic in the national plan consultations we ran in late 2023. Donna Swan is asking, are the IPV statistics captured from family violence services data, as women identify IPV as family and domestic violence, while older men may identify abuse as elder abuse?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things I wondered if that's why there weren't as many female victims as I suspected. But I do know that there were still, the majority of them had been experiencing the abuse for 10 years or more. So it was long term. But I do suspect that there's a chance that that is why the numbers are low. I don't have data to support that or answer that question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks, Donna. Anne Maldoni, we've got a few more questions to go, which we're not going to get to. We've got 2 minutes or something left on this webinar. Anne Maldoni asks, can you interpret from the data the portion of female perpetrators who were previously victims of IPV by the male who is now frail or cognitively impaired?
I don't have the number on me, but it was fairly low because we call it mutual aggression. And we also have information about perpetrators and whether they've had DV orders or that against them from either the victim or others. And so I did look at it, but it was very low, and it wasn't significantly different depending on whether the victim was female or male. So it was one of the areas I was interested in because I did think that that might be going on, but I know it does happen. It wasn't different between male and female victims.
Yeah.
It was quite low.
And we know that there's some research being undertaken at the moment about people who cause harm. And we know that's also a strong element of the draft second national plan. So it will be an area of focus for the next 10 years or so of this plan. Nadine Ramsey asks, was IPV inclusive of sexual assault or was this recorded separately?
So that included sexual assault.
Okay.
Or sexual abuse more broadly.
Okay. And I'm going to do one last question, so be a quick answer, hopefully. Victoria Vivante, sorry if I pronounced your last name incorrectly. Anna, I'm about to do an honours paper on mandatory reporting of elder financial abuse in banks. Happy to touch base. So that will be a very quick answer. I'm sure she'll be very keen to chat to you. I don't know whether you two know each other already, but
I don't, but I'd be really keen to hear.
So Victoria, perhaps go via James at membership@eaaa.org.au and we'll connect you and Anna. We're about to hit 1:30, which is the end of our webinar. I'd just like to, one thing I've known about Anna, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is she has an absolute dedication and passion in data and help and allowing that data to inform us more, the service that she works with, of course, and the governments that agencies that fund the service. But I think it's by the number of your questions, and there's now 16 in here, and I think we've got to about 14 of them. You have that same interest in data and what it can tell us, what it can show us, how things need to change into the future. So thank you all very much, apart from Anna joining us in her presentation. But thanks for joining us this afternoon. As I mentioned earlier, the link to the recording will be distributed to everyone who's registered for this webinar, but it will also be up on the EAAA site in the coming days. Lunch and Learns are now held monthly, and our next speaker will be Bridie Murphy from Age Rights Advocacy Service in South Australia, who will be speaking about humbugging. If you don't know what this is or you'd like to learn more, please register for our next session, which will be on Thursday, 10th of April at 12:30. If you're an organisation member of EAAA and you'd like to present some of your work, please contact James Thomas at membership@eaaa.org.au. And I think we all look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks so much, Anna. Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.